So who are you and what do you do?
John Winsor. I'm the chairman and founder of Open Assembly and author of a new book called Open Talent.
Yeah, we have a bit of a history we were talking about before.
Yeah, yeah.
I would say normally it's ships passing in the night, but we actually had collided a couple times over the years. And I remember you in particular having a very senior role at a very famed ad agency, Crispin Porter Bogutsky.
Exactly.
But John, I mean, your career was phenomenal. You were one of these people who was really advocating for thinking differently about how we create and how consumers can co-create with us. You went on to create a very well-known agency called Victors and Spoils, which, like you sold to a larger company as I
Exactly.
did.
Yeah.
You stuck around a little bit, and then you moved into a different part of the world, but I'm sure still very much thinking about brands and businesses and how we work, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think it's all the same, right? It's all about what's the narrative and how do you overcome the current narrative or the historical narrative and create a new narrative.
So I got the new book, Open Talent, and I think it's worth a moment just talking about what you mean by the open talent space. And I will submit that I think it's a really controversial perspective you're bringing to this.
Ah, well, that's great, man. I like controversial
Yeah.
perspectives. So thanks for that. Yeah, the idea, has been I've been searching for a way to kind of create a big tent. And, after I sold my company to a boss and ended up at Harvard, they were doing a bunch of really interesting crowdsourcing stuff. And because of Victors and Spoils was called, an ad agency based on crowdsourcing principles. And, I think we picked that because we wanted to be a little provocative for the agencies, writ large. And it felt like it had a lot of baggage, right? And I think that same thing with the gig economy. Like there are a bunch of people that kind of threw around the name. Paul Estes wrote a great book called Gig Mindset, and he did some great work at Microsoft. But again, gig mindset was a little bit where crowdsourcing got put into the outsourcing, maybe abusive practices gig kind of happened the same thing, right? And we were talking about I at Harvard at least we were talking about something different. It was like those people that chose to go work in an independent way and had the digital tools to do that, decided to say, wow, I'm really experienced at agency work. I can go make a living giving speeches and live in this digital age of creating podcasts and new kinds of things. It was really open to a new term that was kind of over everything. And so that's why we kind of landed on open talent. The idea that it really came from open source software, right? The idea that that was really the invention of this new idea that, things could be created anywhere and transported globally across the internet.
And when it comes to people, there's a couple of aspects to this. One being that you have consumers that have become really great at generating content. Some
Amazing.
trope I was floating out in the early 2000s, but you fast forward and being an influencer is a profession, which is
Yeah.
really unique. It's no
Yeah.
longer we hope they can make something for us, is they are already creating better than us. And how do we engage with them? The other interesting development is you have these platforms out there like Fiverr and Upwork and 99 Design where people are no longer relegated to great creative work by word of mouth or local classifieds. They can post their work and either auction it off or sell it for a certain fee. Very unique. And then we have this major shift in our world, which happens because of the pandemic. And you have people forced to work remotely, some of them then making a decision to do it professionally, which I have some plus and minus thoughts about. So
Sure.
you have these kind of different types of working, but coming together in a unique way. But at the same time, we have business leaders who are trying to run the business of the day, and they're really struggling with all of these concepts. How do you synthesize that in a way where a leader goes, I could put my finger on that and see a future versus I've got all these FTEs everywhere that I got to figure out?
Yeah. I mean, try to start on the macro level. One is that the reality, according to Corn Ferry, is that there's going to be 85 million tech jobs that will not be filled by 2030. And that's going to cost companies $8.5 trillion. And anybody who thinks that they can hire the best talent today is, they're just not going to happen. Um, Great talent has options, and that's because if you look at the 85 million number, it's like there's more demand than there is supply. And so supply all of a sudden has the economic advantage. That hasn't historically been the case. As you and I know, agencies, if you had a great agency brand, people were flocking to your door to work for you. That doesn't really happen anymore. I was really interested in and wrote a little bit about that yesterday, about the Wonderman, the Wonderman JW, T thing, right? And now it's called VML, and two great brands, along with Ogilvy or sorry, not Ogilvy, but what Young and Rubicam are gone. And it's really unfortunate. I think the mistake, especially for JWT, who's been around since 1864, right?
First ad agency. That's who acquired us. So that was our
Yeah.
main acquirer.
Yeah. It's like, it's not about the brand that's irrelevant. It's about it's about the operating system of the agency that's irrelevant. And I think they would have been better served by, instead of saying, we're getting rid of this brand and going to rebrand it into this digital, agency, to say, we're going to remake the way we work and keep that brand there that's relevant. And just, and it seems like probably since 1864, JWT's done that a few times, right? Reinvented kind of what they have to do. And unfortunately, changing business models are really, really hard to do.
So there's one thing when you're changing the business model, you're figuring out product, service. You get into our favorite 4 Ps of price, product, promotion, place. There's a dynamic there.
Mm,
What you're talking about primarily is the people.
exactly.
This is a strange thing. We have RTO, return to office.
Right.
I don't know where we land on this. It looks like 3 days as we're pushing capacity here. If that,
Yeah.
we have seen commercial real estate be interesting. In this instance, we have some tech companies taking up a lot more space, unique turn of events. You have many demanding more of a return, many questioning what they defined as successful productivity during the pandemic and post-pandemic moment.
Mhm.
But you have a workforce that has changed or is thinking about change. What do you make of that? If I were to ask you, what do you think is going on here, John? What do you
Yeah.
think is going on here?
I mean, I think, first of all, it's a generational thing, right? Like if you look at kids, there was a great article in the Washington Post last week on creators, $250 billion industry now, 60 million people that make money from marketing online. Like those are the competitors to ad agencies. No wonder ad agencies are shrinking so much, right? So that's just one category. I also think that, this idea of place-based work, it's just radically changed, right? It's like the problem, at least in the businesses that we worked in, right, is that I look at the managed service or the consulting business, right? And a consulting company typically charges 5 times somebody's salary to do work. And so, historically, you needed that in an analog world. You needed the ability, and essentially those brands were matching agents, right? It was like, I need a really good digital strategist. I'll go to Accenture. They'll have a great one. They're guaranteed the work, but I'm paying 5 times the salary. In every other industry, right? Digital technologies has made that matching mechanism much, much more efficient. So now you can go to a platform, like you said, Upwork or Fiverr or TopTal, and read the reviews of everybody that's worked with that person and looked at the 5 stars and look at their portfolios, dig way deep and hire that person for maybe 1.5 times what a Deloitte would pay them. But that's still a lot less than the 5 times that Deloitte or Accenture would hire them. So I think that's what's going on. I think that there's a mindset shift. We're both of us are old dogs, right? We've kind of done that. I like being in an office. I like that
Say the same
idea,
thing.
right? Yeah. It's like, so, I get it for sure. But one of the things that just blew me away, during the pandemic is I often live in, I have a house in Mexico where I lived for a long time, 28 years, on and off. And the thing that blew me away in Mexico was that you had kids, not our generation, in their 20s. And imagine, you're a mid-level, executive, let's just say marketing for a tech company in New York, and you're getting paid 80 grand, but it's costing you $85,000 to live in the city or in Brooklyn, right? That's just the way it is. It's a scratch. COVID happens. You move to Mexico, to a small town like Sayulita. You can live for $1,000 a month really well. Surf twice a day, eat out every meal, have a nice apartment. All of a sudden, you're pulling in $60,000 a year net. And you're like, wait a second, this is a pretty good thing. Remote in Mexico, netting 60K or losing 5K and living in the city. And sorry, I ain't going to do it. Like, I'm going to find other people that are willing to, allow me to work remotely. And the better the talent, the more options those people have. And so I just don't think that it's going to happen, right? I don't think that we're in a place that people are going to go back to work. I mean, there are going to be people that want to do it. I think this is going to become a whole new alchemy of lots of different systems. But that's the issue for leaders, right? It's like, how do you manage in this new world of abundance where you've got external talent cloud, you're trying to create internal talent marketplaces to allow for people to guide their own career. And then you've got these ways to engage contractors in work contests and things. It's really difficult. It's a big mindset shift.
Well, and people are ultimately saying it's not working.
Exactly.
This is the provocation. Provocation would be that I don't think there's a hard period after your thought of that young person who's now living in Mexico versus the US, because what you are seeing, we live in a capitalist world, is companies saying, well, I used to kind of put the finger on the scale a little bit that if you lived in New York versus Montreal and cost of living, and now they're saying, well, we're going to impact wages across the board. If you can live cheaper, that's going to be your problem if you want to live in a more expensive place. It doesn't feel like that's going to be the burden of the company. It's going to be the burden of the employee, which in theory might drive employee wages down. There's also the fears of things like lack of healthcare. What do you do?
Sure.
I mean, there's a lot of things happening in this gig economy that many people, including some of the founders who develop some of these companies, are really pushing back on.
Mm-hmm.
They're the ones who are screaming, like, turn these Uber drivers into full-time employees and give them benefits.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot that has to be figured out. And I think it's really a country by country thing, right? Like a lot of the EU countries that have, socialized healthcare, that are inviting people into digital, be digital nomads in their countries, give these golden passports. They might have a strategic advantage, right? They might have this ability to allow individuals or workers to have that financial arbitrage. My sense is that one of the issues is that, we're still in this mindset of most companies are to fill roles, right? We want to fill a role to get a job done. Like the role gets filled, to define the tasks, to get an outcome, right? And I would propose that really what we need to do today and executives need to do is think about what tasks need to be done and what outcomes do I need. Let's not think about the roles. I think you can see this. I mean, let's just say, Mitch, you just got promoted and you got hired to be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And you say, okay, AI is going to really affect my company. I need a strategy. Well, there's two ways to go, right? The old way of doing it is to go to your CHRO, your head of HR, and say, hey, I need a role. I need an SVP of AI that has industry knowledge that can help me. How long do you think that's going to take to hire? 8 months, maybe, right? 6 months, maybe, if you're lucky. Well, if she gets hired, she's going to take another 6 months to hire her team. And it's going to take them 3 months to do the strategy. In the world of AI, 18 months, you're toast. Now, the alternative is, if you're the executive, you could say, I need an outcome. I need a strategy. I want to pull in off these platforms, off Business Talent Group, Experify, Graphite, some of the higher end platforms. Let's find the 10 best experts that have knowledge of our industry, but are AI experts. Let's bring them up to Montreal. Let's have a 2-day session. Let's write down the top 100 tasks that need to be done to create a strategy. Of those 10 people, maybe half of those tasks can get done by that team, really kind of leaning into their networks to figure out the other tasks to be done in those folks. And in a month, you have a fully baked strategy by this diverse team. And you've had a bunch of people that you can really meet and greet and work on a project basis that you've got out of those, 25 people. There's probably 5 in there that you want as a team. So 18 months, roles come first, fit the system, you're toast. Or a month and you have your strategy and you know exactly who you need to hire, who's going to get the strategy done for. So that's the alternative.
Do you worry culturally, though, that you're creating a world of mercenary employees and that you're not building things like culture, long-term dedication? I'm in it because I have a knowledge base. Because the outcome of that could be, if I were to roll it out that, oh, I'm really good at doing this. And I got hired by John's company and Mitch's company and Sarah's
Yeah,
company.
totally.
But are you getting better at that? Are you adding to your skill set, or are you constantly in this repetitive work that you do? Because again, the challenge with that would be AI, from a
Right.
knowledge perspective, is exceptionally good at crushing repetitive type skills like that inevitably. So do you think
Totally.
about it from that perspective of, well, you're, as an employee, you are to a certain degree, maybe not really adding as an employee, you're a mercenary. So, I mean, I'm putting a negative spin on the
Yeah,
idea
yeah.
because
No,
we grapple
that's
with this.
yeah. No, I think that's a good point. Some of the statistics we worked on through the book was that what we realized is that the average organization in the US spends 0.3% of somebody's salary on job specific skill training, right? They do a lot of DEI, they do a lot of other kind of cultural training, but job specific, like, hey, Mitch, AI is going to really change the way you do podcasts. We're going to give you, 25 hours of training on this. It's like, no, Mitch, you need to figure it out on your own in your off hours and, do it, right? To be relevant. Or the threat always is like, we're going to hire somebody that gets that. Now, if you're a freelancer out in the freelance world, the average freelancer spends 15% of their time learning. So in my book, who would I rather hire? Somebody that has 0.3% of their salary dedicated or their time dedicated to training, or somebody that spends 15% training. I want the person that's it. Learning is critical. I want the learner. That's what I need, right? And I don't care if in fact, I like the fact he works for you. I like the fact that they work for somebody else because they're bringing that knowledge to me as an organization, and I'm upskilling as well, right? I can say, okay, this is a whole new world.
One of the
So,
earlier books that really drove this home for me was Dan Pink's Free Agent Nation in
right. I
2001.
know exactly. Right.
And I was having crazy flashbacks reading Open Talent to this idea that, well, it's really interesting to think quarter of a century later, what's happened. It's
I know.
wild when you talk about the prognosticating that happened in Free Agent Nation to this moment in time where it's almost everywhere.
I know. It's crazy because I was really inspired by that book. And that's when I started doing my work when I had, women's sports and fitness and started Radar, that idea of like, wait a second, there are all these really talented, in my case, athletic women or professional, not professional, but really good female athletes that instead of me waiting for, Crispin Porter Bogusky to run an ad in women's sports and fitness for one of their clients like Nike, why not have that community of early adopted consumers and put them at the top of the funnel and charge Nike, you know, those insights and that strategy from these really talented women for strategy for product and marketing. And so that to me started this journey, and it was really inspired by Dan's book. There's so much good work there, but systems take a long time to change. I was listening to a podcast today about, the issue with historical narratives. And they were talking about, the tragedy in the Middle East and this narrative around the 1948, th-
Balfour Declaration, yeah.
exactly. And so you've got a situation where there are a bunch of group of people that look at that one thing and have completely different narratives on that, right? And it's really hard to get them to advance and have a conversation. It's like, no, that's black, and no, that's white, or whatever those things are, right? And these historic narratives are really hard to change. My sense is that you go back to Sloan's work, at GM, and the way that companies are formed is very much a militaristic, top down. That's the way we've really organized, right? And so even digital companies are still have vestiges of that structure left over. That's not how the world works in a digital world. We don't work in this top down, let's get out, 40,000 cars this year. That's not the way that the world is operating. And so we've got to change our narrative around what a company is, how it works, how we aggregate talent. What do we need to onboard and offboard talent much, much quicker. We need to push it from fixed cost to variable cost. And there's lots of changes, but this is a rewiring of a whole social system, right? That's deep in a narrative of how it works.
I think that's what I was grappling with as I was going through Open Talent, because to a certain degree, you and I are either privileged or
There's no
we're
doubt.
so many feet ahead of everyone else. And I'll explain why. I go back to 2000 when I started the agency business. I always joke that the business model is pretty simple, and you alluded to it. I'm paying for a human unit of time more money than I'm charging for it.
Exactly.
We would always sit extremely tight. This was the joke in our industry. I had no bench. I had
Right.
no creative directors or digital strategists on the bench. Client, bring in a multi-million dollar client, they'd say, you have people ready to go. And you're like, yeah, of course I do. And you would pull from this freelance pool that you had developed as needed, you could bring up and bring down while still growing a physical agency because, yeah, there were things like market capitalizations and fixed costs were perceived to be a valuable asset. You had
Exactly.
150 people in 2 offices and blah, 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 blah. That was
Right.
part of the game. So, in a way, you and I were a little bit ahead of the curve by business model design. We had to rely on freelancers. We had to rely on these
Exactly.
people. But to bring those people into these other organizations, I think creates a bigger chasm for most people because they almost can't wrap their heads around the fact that they can't produce the work without that.
Right. Right. No, I totally agree. It's a leadership mindset shift from kind of a scarcity model, right? I mean, that's what always was blown away by in the agency business. It's a scarcity model. It's like, we can get anybody we want, like the best talent versus an abundant model going, wow, there's so many smart people in the world. How do we get them to work on these specific tasks when we need them, how we need them? That's so much more powerful. The problem is it's just so misaligned with the way that agencies told the narrative of how they charge. Like they're not charging for a networked organization that taps into people globally. They're charged for, we have a staff of 250 people working on your business every day. You own them essentially. And I think that's the big shift, right? Like the ownership of the talent versus the renting of the
But there's something in IP that is unique. And the story that I would tell is how often did you get business come up for review? And the institutional knowledge of the brand resided without a doubt within the agency side. The brand did not have it. And you saw this fail either because they wanted whatever was shiny, bright at the time, agency model wise,
talent. Right.
or I've seen situations now where 10 plus years later, I know that they've retained some of the clients we want, and there is no letting go of this agency brand relationship because of this institutional knowledge. There's something in there too that I don't want to dismiss that anybody can
No,
come in and do this. What do you do in a world where there's not much institutional or legacy? We don't act as chaperones of the brand, we act as mercenaries. I could see that backfiring too.
I totally agree. I think that, one of the things, it's all cyclical, right? I mean, one of the things that I really enjoyed about Crispin is that we were the mercenaries, right? I mean, that's what our brand was. We'd go in and blow shit up. Like we change culture to your advantage. And, you know, but one of the things I learned after the Christmas experience is, talking to guys like an American Express, even though we did work for them, really, I think it was, is it Ogilvy that owns I can never remember, Amex. Anyway, whoever the agency was explained to us that, hey, everybody at upper level management inside Amex changes jobs every 18 months. We're the only ones that have the historical
Right.
knowledge.
For the consistency.
Exactly. And so they're not going to fire us. Like it's not going to happen. Like you little guys at Crispin have a good time working on those new innovative things. All the while, we're just going to be cranking out the big stuff. And I totally agree with that. I don't think it takes 200 people to do that, and I think what's happened is, at least in my experience, one of my foundational experiences as an entrepreneur is, I had Radar and it was going great. And then I merged that with Alex, because he had 40 guys who moved to Boulder and we had 15 of us. And, we went from that 55 to 750 in Boulder, like in 2 years. It was a crazy ride. But a couple of things that really blew me away was just the way that the agency functioned. It's like, oh, Alex, myself, a few other people, we're getting charged out at 400% of our time, 100% across 4 clients. Like, that's kind of interesting. And then
Sounds like a lawyer's office.
right, exactly. And, same thing, like when we won some of these bigger accounts, like how much should we charge? Like whatever they're willing to pay, it's like, it'd be like, it's going to take 220 people to do the work. Client would say, bullshit, it's going to take 180. Say, okay, 200. And then you go hire 50 and make everybody else work a lot harder. Right. And so I think that kind of, whether it's in consulting or it's in agencies, that was one of the things that killed the business because there was this knowledge on the client side that there's not a lot of transparency there, and there's a lot of stuff going on. And I think that's really hurt, that's really accelerated this change and, this radical drop. I mean, I, you know, I'm so sad that, and when you realize, I guess the guys at Stagwell are trying to reinvent Crispin now, but Crispin got all the way down to 4 people that work kind of remotely. And now they've been put with, observatory and other things. But, it's just such a huge shrink. And I think that was part of it, right? Is this, like win with the sword and die with the sword, or whatever that saying is, right? It's like great to go slay some dragons. It's like, when your tools used on you, it's to be pretty brutal.
So walk me through how you would think about doing this in an open talent world where you want the business to build a culture. I mean, otherwise, if it's just a bunch of freelancers, what is it other than the price it charges for products and services?
Mhm.
And let's talk a little bit about this institutional knowledge. How do you have that in a world where you're leveraging a high capacity around this open talent idea? What would you submit to the CEO of an organization? Like, culture is still important. You got to maintain this consistency and have this to have something to offer.
Mhm.
How do you reconcile those with this idea of great talents everywhere and just hire people as you want? It feels like those two don't run in sync. And if they do, explain to me how.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. One of my favorite guys, and I just talked to him this morning. His name's Paul Libko, and he's the CTO and CXO of Wellmark, which is a big, Blue Cross Blue Shield organization. And his point is like the idea of corporate culture is total bullshit. It's a mythology, right? He's like, it doesn't work. And his point is like, you have 10 offices, you got 10 different corporate cultures, right? So, you got 20 offices, you got 20 of them. So the idea that, I believe, because like you, I'm a brand guy, and I think brands are super important, and internal brands are super important. But really great brands live way beyond the employees, right? They exist in culture. And, I think you can look at a brand like Nike or Apple that, just we all want to be a part of that, right? So it's that good storytelling. I don't think that matters if a brand is, 5,000 people or 50 people. That 50 people with a bunch of freelancers can create as good a brand as 5,000 people. A lot of times even better, right? And make that attraction. I think you have to shift your paradigm to say there is definitely a core. We need to protect the core. We need to build the brand. We need to do that. But we also need to get tasks done. And does everybody need to have the same commitment to the brand when we need those tasks? Why not have some mercenaries that are the very best in the world at getting this UX design done in 2 hours versus in 2 weeks? I think that's what you're seeing, right? You're seeing that, at least in the experiences and the experiments we've done at Harvard with clients or with companies like Deloitte, is that, you hire somebody full time, it takes them a long time to onboard. And there's a corporate pace that takes weeks to do things, right? Versus you hire somebody that's I'm sorry, my camera's it's
It's all
here.
good. Don't worry about it.
So you hire somebody that's a mercenary that can do that same task in a couple days. And I think that's the balance, right? There are some things that should be taskified. There's some things should be very strategic. I don't think that strategic core is the same size, just like every organization has shrunk in size, right? Digital technology has wiped out these mid layers of folks. So, that's kind of my thinking on the culture question is like, yes, culture is important. But culture isn't just you and your employees. It's you and your employees and your suppliers and your customers and where your brand lives in culture. That's where I'd be focused, not, creating that culture for employees. That's the thing that gets me, right? It's like that the whole HR, the whole, HR industrial complex, and they have really 2 jobs, right? They have 2 jobs. Like, how do I find the best people? How do I make them happy, engaged? And how do I create longevity? But tell me, like those 2 things, right? What does that have to do with any outcome a company has to do? I want
Right.
employees to stick around for a long time. Really? Because they might not be the right person to work on that project. Right. And so anyway, I'm one of the examples, just to finish, one of the examples that I loved at VNS when we started doing VNS is I had so many people call me and go, I work at JWT and we go out to lunch and grab, a sandwich, and then we come back and we shut our doors and we work for Victors and Spoils. because we're all stuck on a diaper brand, or on radio, and we want to do the cool shit on Harley Davidson that you guys have going on. Like, give me the cool stuff, but I'm in the bureaucracy of JWT and I'm stuck on diapers. And so that's the conundrum, right?
So you can respect how contentious this perspective is, John. And I know you're
Oh,
not
for
one
sure.
to step away from being a disruptor.
Yeah.
I used to watch you on stage and say to myself, here I am being this disruptor saying how online advertising is going to destroy TV advertising, and people thought I was a heretic. And you're on stage seeing things like, we don't even need creatives anymore. We're going to just, so I mean, so I get that, but I'm asking you this in a world where I don't think a conversation I have on this show or out in the real world isn't about the challenge of culture. This idea that everything right now is even pushed, that I even would even prescribe to, of forget the customer experience, but the employee experience. And what are we doing to make people feel satiated and engaged and want to show up every day? We're talking about leaders as coaches. We're talking about moving away from crappy incentives like free lunch and dry cleaning to real engagement at work that makes people want to show up. And the brand guy, you are saying, I don't know if we need that. It's a real big statement, John.
Thanks. Well, I truly believe that.
Thanks.
My own career, right? Is like, nobody cares about your brand. Like, nobody cares about your office. People care about themselves. Like, all of us are selfish. If your brand's going to help you as an employee get to where you want to go, awesome. I'll buy into that mythology. I want to be around those people. I want to do great things. That's what I loved about Crispin. Like, Crispin, it was one of the greatest. When I started at Crispin, we had this great, when we were growing crazy, we had this great town hall meeting, and I love Alex. I still hang out with him a bunch. And Alex, people were really conservative, like, oh, we have this, we're growing like this. So we have,
For people who don't know, let's just create. So Alex Bogutsky was the creative director, Crispin Porter Bogutsky, cover of Fast Company. They were calling him the Steve Jobs of advertising.
Exactly.
He had come up with some of the biggest viral and ad-based stuff in the world. I just want to create some context around Alex, who's been on the show, but go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks. Yeah, no, Alex. One of his magics was that he just didn't care. And it's not like he didn't care. I'm not saying that in an arrogant way. He's just very clear. And what his point was, because the controversy is like, we have this growth, we have 60% turnover in the creative department. Like, what the hell do we do? And Alex's response was like, I don't care. So somebody asked that in a town hall meeting, and he said that, right? He's like, I don't care. And people were aghast. And they're like, what do you mean? You don't care about us? You don't care about the work? He's like, listen, like, you guys come here because we do the best work in the world. And you guys come here and everybody gets their name on the reel, right? On the commercial, whatever it is. And it could be 2 months into your thing. You don't get paid a lot here. We're going to work your ass off. It's 24/7. But I guarantee you, in 6 months, you can go to New York with your reel and get 3 times your salary. And awesome. Go do that. That's exactly, I'm using you, but you're using me. Let's be really clear about this. Let's do it together, but let's get some really great shit done. And that clarity was just amazing, right? It's like, good. In 2 months, if you need to leave to go get the big job at Ogilvy, awesome. Glad you were here. Great work. Next.
There's a chunk of the population that wants a little bit of safety. They want a little bit of comfort.
That's for sure. But I think it's what your brand is, right? Like, go to Ogilvy for safety. Like, get that job, right? That's awesome. But if you want to like rock your career and triple your stuff, like, come to Crispin. And if you look around the agency world, the vestiges of very senior guys across the industry are all folks that were at Crispin during those days, right? Because they honed their teeth on the craziest stuff that was coming out of the industry. And it still has that legacy 10 years later. And so I think that's it, right? It's like every brand has a place to fit somebody's career. If you're an up and comer, go to the most controversial brands that are going to do the best work. If you're our age, go to the safe brands that you can, like, ride into the sunset with. That's totally cool, but know your place, right?
Talk about what it means to be a team member or employee in this world. The analogy I would share with you is we had some people at our organization who'd say things like, I like that you guys built an agency. I should go and do that. And they would boomerang. They try to do it and they just
Okay.
didn't have it in them. You'd have people who would say, I like the work. I want to be more of a freelancer or contractor. They'd leave. They'd start realizing they have to have accounting software. They've got to invoice. They've got to
Horrible.
build. They've got to build a business. They're not spending all their time doing the work. They're spending time getting the clients, trying to do the work, figuring out churn, figuring out the site. It wasn't for them. They boomerang a little bit back. If we live in a world of open talent, there are certain things you need to be as an individual to be successful. Another example I would give that I still think is true is so many people want to stay remote post COVID, but the truth is they were forced remote. These were never institutions that had remote policies that knew how to operate this way. They were never even then trained after it of like, how do I actually live like a digital nomad? You and I could throw that word out there because not only have we lived it, we've chosen a career like that and
Yeah,
we've built infrastructure around it. But now
sure.
people who were forced to do it just think, oh, it just means that whatever is in my calendar, I do on Zoom versus physical. I would submit that that's not true to be successful in
Yeah,
that type of role.
yeah.
How do we prepare individuals for this open talent world?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think, I think it starts with the mindset, right? It starts with an entrepreneurial mindset. I think that's what, if you look at that Washington Post article on creators, like the number, like what is it, 15 years and younger, the number one future job that everybody wants to be is an influencer. They want to be a
Yeah, that's not a good
micro-entrepreneur.
thing. But
Well, I don't know, I don't know if it is or not. I mean, I think there's a lot of bad stuff about it, but
do we
I
just want
love.
to be marketing to each other? Is that what we're trying to do?
Well, no, but I think that the idea is that it's about, taking your career into your own hands. And I think that's one of the things I get excited about when I see companies like Globe who are creating software for people like Unilever and MasterCard, and the paradigm shift to say, my job of Unilever is not to manage your career. My job is to create a platform where there's your job, there's upskilling ideas, there's projects you can work on. This is your playground. We don't want you to leave, but figure out inside Unilever the place you can follow your passion. We'll help you do that. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on inside companies to keep people way more engaged. But I would say, I mean, the story I always tell is my buddy Jimmy Chin, and I talk about that in the book. And I think most people these days know Jimmy because he produced, Free Solo and won an Oscar and all. And so I started hanging with Jimmy back in the day when he was in Yosemite living out of his car because I climb a lot and spend a lot of time around, trying to find climbing partners. And then Jimmy has a house in Sayulita, or had a house in Sayulita. So we spend time on the beach. And so, the way that Jimmy used to work in the analog world was that he got paid by North Face, his sponsor, for expeditions. So he would call the editor of Outside Magazine and say, hey, here are 2 expedition ideas. You want to buy one? Could you do an article about one? And Outside would have to decide, is this a good enough idea that I got to put my resources, an editor and a photographer or a writer and photographer with Jimmy on for 2 months trip, the expense of that, then take 2 months to write the article and produce it, then take 2 months to print it, then take 2 months to get it distributed and get the revenue from North Face for running an ad, right? So you've got 8 months. North Face spending $250,000 for an ad to reach 800,000 people, right? And Jimmy getting a piece of that. That's how Jimmy subsist, out of his car. Well, this thing called Instagram came up, and this company that I helped start with Jimmy called Inkwell. Essentially, the guys at Inkwell took Jimmy Chin, Travis Rice, Chris Burkhardt, and one other photographer. I can't remember his name right now. Anyway, those 4 guys had 25,000 followers each. And the idea the Inkwell guys had is like, we need to create a network. When Jimmy posts something, everybody else posts, right? So this kind of crazy, and it just so happened that it was the beginning of Instagram. So Inkwell went from 4 people and 100,000 followers to 8 years later, 400 creators in the outdoor business with 75 million followers. What happened with that is it meant that Jimmy, because he could push things out to all 75 million followers, his following grew to 3.7 million followers. So now when Range Rover, let's say, wants to do an ad, their choices are, I can pay 250 grand to reach 800,000 people and Outside, and it'll take 8 months. Or I can call Jimmy Chin and say, Jimmy, can you do a photo shoot for Range Rover. And Jimmy will say, I'm climbing this weekend with my buddies in Jackson, drop off a couple cars. I'll drive them around for a couple days. I'll shoot some photos as we're out doing our thing. And I'll post 2 photos on Instagram on Monday morning. That's $50K a photo. So $100,000 for 2 impressions, 3.7 million people, or $250,000 for 1 impression, 800,000 people, 8 months later versus 2 days. Jimmy owns the world. He can do whatever he wants creatively now. And that's the micro entrepreneur that I'm talking about.
But let's talk about what I was trying to get to, which I think is a fair category.
Yeah.
To me, there's a bigger category of people who try it and realize that I even talk about the massive difference between an entrepreneur and somebody who's self-employed.
Yeah.
Somebody who's basically saying, I'm going to work by myself, but I'm just trying to earn the same amount as I would if I did it for someone else.
Mm-hmm.
There's been this fragmentation of it. Now, within that, the larger population aren't either of those. They're people who don't know how to do this. They just want to be a graphic designer. They want to be a copywriter. They want to do some strategy.
Well, I think that really relies on this shift, right? Still, if you look at the staffing contingent workforce area, a lot of our clients, one of our big, consulting global clients spends $800 million on contingent work, but like 4% of that comes from. So they're still in that very much filling the role. And I think what we've got to see is this shift to tasks, and the tasks have a lot of platforms, right? I do think you're seeing that emerge. And there's a great story of this woman in Portland that, during COVID, she worked for a mid-level size accounting firm, getting paid, $32,000 a year. And she, was just in there as a bookkeeper. She got laid off during COVID. Single mom with 2 girls, right? Went on welfare or subsistence, really bad, got COVID herself, really, really tragically. And as a desperation move, she went out on a couple of platforms on Fiverr and Upwork and put her work up saying, hey, I'll do your books for your company. Well, now she charges $800 for 32 companies per month. And she's making close to $400,000 a year, 1 year later. And I think that's what we have to do. We have to, we have to be able to make that transition to say, you're really skilled at bookkeeping. Instead of going to a company and getting this job, then you could go to a platform and we will help you develop those skills and put that out in the world. And the potential is much greater. It's not there yet. The entrepreneurs are there. The early adopters are starting to happen. But the reality is that when you look at the freelance market, 75% of the freelance market are still side gigs. So somebody's got a full-time job, but they're doing what they want on the side, right? And I think that's going to be a long transition.
Talk about generative AI. I would see this as somewhat tipping the scale, or maybe even dramatically in this world.
Mm-hmm.
Products, services that were easy to sell are going to be much more complex to sell if you could have somebody do it without even having the time it takes to go through Fiverr and look at a couple of portfolios. You could generate the prompt and get the output.
For sure.
How do you see this impacting the idea of open talent? I'm a big believer right now when I talk about generative AI that it's a co-pilot, and I use it in ways that aren't for creation purposes. I use it in ways to provoke my thinking, to make my output way better than it could ever be before. But it's not the way the vast majority of companies would think about it. If they needed an article on the 15 reasons why email marketing is going to work, I don't know that they would go to Fiverr versus trying to get a decent result from a prompt.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think what they'll find though is they won't get the kind of engagement that they want. And they'll come back to kind of a co-pilot. I think you're totally right on with the idea of being a co-pilot. Again, I think it's what's happening. We see that across the open talent market, right? It's not like the last people to adopt are these enterprises. But there's what Hayden Brown at Upwork talks about is like, open talent's become the secret sauce. It's like, you're going in, to a big marketing meeting. You did a bunch of, let's just say you work for a big CPG company. You did some market research and it could really change the direction of the product you're working on, right? So you're all excited. This could be a career move for you. You've got the meeting, the big marketing meeting's a week away, and you call the company, graphic design department. They're like, we're 3 weeks out. Existential crisis, right? You don't know what to do. So, you go online, look in Google, like who can help me? And you have a good experience with somebody from Fiverr, $200, they do a great job, right? Or $500, whatever it is. And all of a sudden you get that promotion. I think the same thing is, generative AI is being used in the same way. It's like, I find that everybody's using generative AI. My kids are using it for school. Like, we need to teach people how to use it better, how to, use it in a more proficient way. And I think the people that do that, my least intuition is that it's back to that learning. Like, I want the biggest learners. I want people to go out and explore what that means, how it works, figure out, what's good and what's bad. And those are the freelancers that are out there. They have more time to learn. It's more critical for them to be on top of these skills.
But
But it's going to be dramatic.
do you worry that the economics collapse, that you have smart people like Eric Weinstein talking about this right now, that he's shocked that the world isn't having conversations about the fact that just because this tool exists for the knowledge industry, that it's going to completely change the economy. And if we don't have that conversation yesterday, it's problematic, because what we're ultimately talking about is a world where businesses are buying it as pure commodity. I'm on
Yeah,
Fiverr looking at it. I'm deciding between Fiverr and even if generative AI can get me 80% there.
right.
It seems like there needs to still be a conversation. I don't think we want to be in a place where there's 25% unemployment, or in a place where people are commoditizing their work as if it's a dollar store.
I agree with that. I think that unfortunately we've kind of unleashed this beast, right? And so we're going to have to deal with the consequences. And so, it's, you know, I mean, my hopeful, optimistic sense is that it's like all the other things that have happened in the world economically, right? That the industries radically shift because of some kind of new innovation, and companies go out of business. They can't survive, but new ones with more employees start. And so certainly I worry about, you know, AI and its implication. Is it such a big shift that we can't get there? I think it's going to mean massive retraining. It's going to mean, it's probably going to mean, universal income of some kind. There are lots of things that are going to have to be figured out.
But doesn't open talent push that idea too? Because you're in a place where it's a global market, which means the prices are going to fluctuate, which means there's always someone cheaper, which means you have moved it away. For how long in our business did we talk about, we don't charge for time, we charge for value? And I would just
Right.
sit in the audience yawning, like, give me an
Exactly.
example where you've done this. But suddenly when I see generative AI tools or a global marketplace open up with Fiverr,
Right.
I suddenly do worry that all of a sudden we are in a place where very skilled, very knowledgeable people are having a hyper commoditized challenge.
For sure. Unfortunately, it's the world we live in, right? Unfortunately, like the idea of somebody with a Mac, with InDesign on it, there are kids in Kuala Lumpur that make $500 a month that might be more skilled than the $100,000 a year person that works in an agency in New York, right? Because they've had way more turns on it and they've done way more work. It's technology has flattened the world, and that's the really scary part. I think it's really, really difficult to see how that works out well for the first world countries as we see them now, right? I mean, you've got this. I saw yesterday or the day before some report that said, in 20 years, like 1 out of 4 human beings in the world are going to be African. Like, Africa is the next boom market. And, I've seen that, just talk about the radical shift in technology. When I did my first book in 2002, Beyond the Brand, I lived in Mexico. And so I was trying to figure out, how do I get connectivity? There was one tree on the beach where you could stand beside it to get cell service, right? And there were a bunch of payphones, but there were no other phones in town. And so I found a guy in a school bus that was kind of selling Ontario
I was going
licensed.
to say, oh, Canada for the story. Yeah.
Exactly, right? So, Brian was kind of making his way down the coast, and essentially what he was doing is he was selling these $6,000, satellite dishes, which I bought one. I poured my own cement, on my roof with Brian, went out to the payphone, said, "We're in Northern Ontario, give us the code." It worked pretty well, right? It may put me in business. No other infrastructure jumps. But 20 years later, or 10 years later, we had a cell, 200 yards from our house, and we had fiber optic coming. Now we have fiber optic coming into our house. And so, it's leapfrogged the US. The connectivity in Mexico is way better than the connectivity in Boulder. And so I think that's what's happened, right? And I would suggest that all those iterations that we've had to go through in US of copper wire, like cable, fiber optic, that's been a lot of burned capital for those resources versus Mexico going from zero to fiber optic in one jump, right?
Yeah, or the way we saw Japan with mobile, they didn't
Right.
take infrastructure internet. Even now, we could make the argument for Starlink.
Yeah,
What's happening
exactly.
there?
I know, it's crazy. And so I think innovative people, and that's why I think it's a generational thing. Kids living in their van as climbing bums with the Starlink are having a great time. They don't need to make $100,000, right? They don't need to have the apartment. Now it might shift when they have kids. They want to have a permanent place to live,
Community, schools,
community,
good
schools,
healthcare, things
exactly,
like
all
that.
that stuff, right? But for right now, that's the pressure too, right? You've got not just the kid in Kuala Lumpur, that the amazing graphic designer. You've got the climbing bum in Boulder that sometimes drops by Boulder to go to the climbing gym, but is mostly in the van with the Starlink that's doing, whatever, like physics work for Google or mathematics for some hedge fund, right? So
Wow. I'm just curious. I think I know where you're going to go with this, but I would be remiss if we didn't talk about it. What do you think of now when someone says team building? What does team building even look like in an open talent framework? Or is it kind of the way you're talking about culture in the same way of like, I don't know, like, do we really need that? Like, give me the tasks, make it work, see ya.
yeah, but I think it's super critical. But if you look at the way that the guiding principles, agile software development, now, scaled agile is trying to bring this to organizations, to agile organizations. Agile organizations are ones that have hyper focus on teams, but teams aren't very permanent. Like, they're very task driven. Putting this team together, we're going to go fail on some things. We're going to reconstitute it. And I would say in this world of, digital connectivity, it doesn't really matter if teams, all full-time employees or it's separate with, some full-time folks, some non-full-time folks. To me, one of the really hopeful signs and exciting things for me in the open talent world is this whole idea of neurodiversity. There's a whole category of folks that couldn't fit in or didn't want to fit in to offices, right? They just didn't feel comfortable. They didn't bring their best game. They had their own, challenges, and now they get to participate, right? And then there was this whole thing that was happening that kind of discovered, and it really came out in COVID, was that people also started talking about kind of racial microaggressions, following the secretary out to the parking lot because of the color of her skin, like those kinds of little things, or people locking their car doors. It just wiped that all away. It's like, we're all equal on Zoom, right? It's all about our ideas. It's all about our delivery. Did we get the job done or not? Did they turn, their camera on or not? Like, it's kind of more binary. Did they do great work or not? And I think that's really beautiful. There's some democratization that happens.
There's also something around community in a different way. It sounds to me that if there were a macro output of what you're talking about, John, there's this idea in there that we might well get beyond this idea of when you see someone out in the open and you say to them, what do you do? They don't just spit back their job and title description, but they actually
Right.
talk about what they do. And work is an aspect of their life, but not the definition of character.
Exactly. No, I think that's what COVID taught us, right? Like, work's a thing we do, right? It's not a place we go. It's not owned. I don't know about you, but one of the things I found really interesting is that, it really, I think both of us are old enough to remember a different time when, we defined ourselves. If somebody would have asked us in high school or asked me in high school, like, who are you? I'd be like, I'm from Canton, Illinois, and I play football, and like, it would be, that's who I was, right? Now it doesn't, like, I do this work because of who I am. But what I found in COVID was, and maybe you had the same experience, but we started gathering in our neighborhood. Like, we were like, oh, I didn't even know you're my next door neighbor for 15 years. I don't know your kids' names. I don't know who you are. And all of a sudden we start sharing experiences and having kind of, distanced cocktails. And it really became, for our neighborhood, became a huge deal of bringing this new spirit of like, wait a second, I looked to work to do all these social things. And you think about it, right? And you think about, well, if you get your self-worth and self-identity from work versus in a social setting, whether that's activity like climbing or, pickleball, whatever it is, it how do we have confidence in our self-identity in a work environment when inherently in capitalism, we're being judged for everything we do? Like that seems so wrong. Like, wait a second, you're gonna mold my identity and I'm gonna act in a certain way because I know I'm being judged subconsciously. So I'm gonna turn into this kind of person versus I'm in a neighborhood. We're really diverse. Can you take care of my cat? Absolutely. I didn't like what you did. You didn't scrape my snow. That that builds a better community, right? And I think that that's what's missing, and what COVID really highlighted for all of us is that we shouldn't get our self-worth or our self-identity from work. That work is a part of this grander life, but we've got to move beyond that, right? So,
That's great. So, John, tell me the one thing that made you think differently.
oh man, I mean, two big experiences. One is I was caught in an avalanche in the 90s. 12, 14 of us were buried. It was a pretty big deal, but that was one thing, and it really spoke to the fact that we had, I was in the outdoor industry on the board of Black Diamond, and it was an industry trip. So, it always harkens in work situations because it was the very best team in the world, right? It was like the best team, all professional skiers, all professional guides, and we still got whacked. Nobody died, but we still got whacked. But I think the bigger thing is, my wife, Bridget, who I was married to for 32 years, I'd sold my company to Havas and I was working in Paris, but we were living in Mexico. We built a school there called Costa Verde International School, and our kids were going to school there, and just life was perfect. I was done. I was like, this is it. I'm gonna ride off. I'm gonna surf off into the sunset. And Bridget got really sick. She got really sick with bipolar, and 3 year super hard journey that really ripped the soul out of this whole community in Boulder. And unfortunately, she committed suicide, and the ravages of that, it's just really changed my point of view on what success looks like, what's important to be doing, how do we fit into community? Where do we spend our time? I'm so grateful for that. I really miss her. And I'm remarried to an amazing woman Emily, who's a friend of Bridget's, but I'm so, I really believe that, those of us or those people in our lives, sometimes the candles that burn brightest burn shortest. And my relationship with Bridget was a real gift, the gift of perspective now of what's really important in life. What do you need to focus on? Let's build more community and put all this kind of BS of, all the stuff that drives so much of our world, right? Egos and histories and all that stuff. So anyway, that's kind of the thing that's changed me the most and why I'm doing the work I'm doing now.
It's a big one and a great one, John. So the new book is called Open Talent. You've got other great books, Baked In, Spark, Flipped, Beyond the Brand, and more. Let people know where they can find out more about Open Talent and just connect to the work that you're doing. I know you try to put work out there a
Yeah.
lot. So where
Yeah.
does that go?
Thanks. It's on LinkedIn a lot, just 'cause that's the easiest way to find it. X, I guess we call it now. Um, I try to do a lot of stuff. Harvard, I'm writing a lot of case studies, so you can just look at it, HBS, for that. Not only the book, but in January, the Jan-Feb issue of the Harvard Business Review magazine has an article about the book and building an external talent cloud, what it takes to do that. So look for that. But yeah, just psyched to continue to have the conversation. And I think this has been such a great conversation because it's made me reflect. I don't think of myself as a radical, but I guess,
Totally,
everybody
John.
else.
Please. Oh my God.
And so, I'm just trying to make, the world a better place for the people that want to go do what they want to do, right? I want people to be able to pursue their passions and have the kind of economic freedom to do that and be able to work when they want and how they want. And that's my real desire because, at the end of the day, I've got my van parked out here that was my COVID project. And Last week, I drove to the desert and parked in the middle of nowhere, and I was the dirtbag, mountain bike, climber. And those are the finest days in my life. So I
That's
want to
great.
do more of that stuff.
Well, John, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.